Well, thank you everybody for joining us today, this afternoon or morning or wherever you are. So my name is Astrid Aramang, and I'm a manager of communities with Building Belonging and Climate Transition here at the Tamarack Institute. So welcome to the session on data collaborations for emergency preparedness. And before we get into our session today, I would like to offer you a land acknowledgement. And I want to acknowledge and express my respect to the lands on which we live, work, and benefit from, and in which we gather today as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland, as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatsiavut and the Innu of Nitassinan, and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. There is a tradition of knowing, teaching, and learning on this beautiful land that goes beyond settler education. Land is sacred to Indigenous peoples, and ways of being and knowing come from the land. Land acknowledgements recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Land acknowledgements are means of creating awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. By giving land acknowledgements, we disrupt the settler colonialism and challenge the myth that the land was empty when settlers arrived. And land acknowledgements must be accompanied by a commitment to real change, and they become meaningful if we are willing to learn and exercise accountability and deep respect. Establishing a respectful relationship starts with the act of acknowledging one another. And so by doing this land acknowledgement, it is one intentional step in my personal journey of addressing the legacy of colonialism. And with that, I invite you all to reflect and think of the ways your life and work may contribute to decolonization and reconciliation. So with that, we'll get onto our session. So as always, you know that we are recording this and we will share the slides and any links that we are offering in the session, as well as the recording in the follow-up email. And if you have any difficulties tech-wise, just message in the chat and I will try my best to help you out. Finally, just reminding everybody that Tamarack learners, as we come into these spaces, we agree to center equity, inclusion, and a sense of connection for everybody here. And it's our priority and responsibility to protect everyone's safety and well-being, as well as our members, our presenters in the learning community. So by participating here today, you agree to participate with openness and respect for everyone. Okay. So we have a bit of a long-standing tradition of kind of doing a round of introductions in the room. And we are 14 today. But I think what we'll do is just in interest of just time and so that we can have more time to have a discussion with Jean-Noé, I'll invite you all to share in the chat box your name, what organization, the place you're coming from, and what brings you here. And if you have any questions as you're coming into the session about data collaborations for emergency preparedness. And then we can then take those questions afterwards in the discussion. Okay. And finally, for those of you who are here for the first time today, what is this community of practice about? So this community of practice is really about a group of peers, folks across the country, coming together, learning from one another to accelerate our collective knowledge about how communities can take a more active role in preparing for emergencies, how we can share insights, practices about emergency preparedness in communities across the country. And we take an asset-based and community and collective impact lens to this work. So we're really focusing on the inherent strengths, knowledge, and assets of the place and the people, for emergency preparedness. And I think with that, I am going to pass it over to Jean-Noé, who is going to talk a little bit about himself, and then we'll dive into today's topic about data collaborations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Astrid. And very nice to see everybody online. I'm joining you from Montreal, and have had the opportunity to partner with Tamarack over the years, and more recently through my role as the co-steward of the Transition Bridges Project, which is an initiative that's really focused on what we're calling systemic mediation that builds a lot on like systems change. So just wanted to name that in terms of my relationship with Tamarack, and I know that you all have your own relationships with Tamarack and with yourselves as well. So what I'd like to do today, because data is such a big topic, and we're adding collaboration on top of that, which makes it even more fun and kind of adds a bunch of nuances and complications, but also a lot of opportunities around that topic. Um, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about kind of like my own story of how I came about being very involved in data collaboratives. And because, as we all know, it's all about kind of your own kind of like perspective and lived experience and, what how you kind of think about the world around you and how you've experienced it. And so I want to share with you how I came about focusing on data collaboratives or collaboration. I want to share with you a few examples of, how I ended up making the bridge between my own experiences on data collaborations and the climate space, which, is very much at the heart, I know, of a lot of the work that a lot of organizations, that are represented here and you individually might be focused on. And then if I may, I'll share with you, some bits of wisdom based on that experience, kind of take it or leave it kind of thing. Okay, and then I obviously don't want to talk for 50 minutes, so I'll try to be brief, but I do want to give you a sense of the topic at hand, because I think it merits kind of being a little bit unpacked. I'm not really big on slides and stuff, so just kind of listen to my voice. That's kind of like my the way that I'm going to kind of share with you today. And we're going to share with you some, some sources and references as I speak to you. Um, okay, so my story. So I've been involved in data related issues longer than I actually realized. I started off my career and my work and very much as a democracy activist, working alongside human rights activists internationally for 10, 15 years. And it was so that was really a privilege and an honor to be able to be in, a dozen different places and really learning about, each context so much. And we're talking like from 2002 up to like 2010 or so. And during that period, I came across kind of civic activists that were talking about opening up data in order to bring more kind of transparency and accountability to public institutions. And they were talking about that concept of open data. And that really kind of struck me because I kind of looked at where I was. And at the time I was in Kenya in Nairobi. And they were very concerned about kind of following discretionary funding of members of parliament and how funding was being allocated to, different communities and whether or not people more broadly, citizens more broadly, were benefiting from those investments, or whether or not the funding only went towards their individual tribes. Okay, and so kind of looked at that situation and kind of went, well, actually, how about I start looking more about my own context, and kind of came back to Canada. And it was a time of crisis in Montreal. And we had our own kind of issues around corruption and collusion with the mayor at the time. And
oh my God, it's loud. Yay.
Just going to ask people if they can mute themselves. Well, we continue to.
Sorry.
It's okay. No problem. It happens. So long story short, really kind of coming into the data space from a political perspective. So through a lens that recognizes dimensions and dynamics of power as it relate to different types of actors that, compete or try to collaborate, whether in the public interest or for their own kind of self-interest. And so data, was kind of like an emerging, piece of that kind of democracy kind of transitions that were occurring. And data was being connected to a bunch of different issues, whether it's, tackling homelessness or housing, and kind of really kind of prototyping and looking at technology and the role that technology could bring. So long story short, ended up as a civic activist, co-founding some of the first open data initiatives in Canada, in Montreal, in Quebec, in Canada, and ended up leading Open North, which was, it still is, a leading organization focused on the power relationships related to data. And so we kind of quickly realized, well, not quickly, actually, we definitely were nudged in that way, but the subjectivity of data, and how, as open data advocates, we were kind of like perpetuating, inequalities, that were really kind of deep seated in our own kind of like systems. So welcomed the opportunity to connect with Indigenous leaders that were really kind of like challenging and kind of looking at kind of the open data movement and enabling us to think through our work through the lens of Indigenous data sovereignty as well. And I mentioned all of this because at the heart of, what those learnings really kind of opened up for me was really a notion around who governs data. Like what data, where does that data come from that, informs the decisions that we make, individually or collectively, and who sets the rules, who sets the norms, and do we have the power ourselves as community, to establish our own kind of like governance for the data that, we rely on or that we want to collect, in order to inform our own kind of civic activism and the way that we advocate for change with government and the way that we build kind of new systems and new services and whatnot. So that, you could probably tell from what I just described that my background is not just in politics, but also in philosophy. And so for me, I like to ask these questions, because I think it's really kind of following the thread of like, who influences, decisions at what stage, and, how do we should and we ought to question, the data that we work with, and, our own digital rights, as advocates and as people that, have quite a lot to benefit from utilizing and leveraging data, but really doing it with not just an open mind, but doing it with kind of like open eyes to kind of really understand what are the systemic dynamics that play out. And one example that I want to kind of focused on, so I was at Open North, and then kind of saw that I was being pulled into a lot of different conversations that related to the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations and communities here in Montreal. And I felt like I wasn't necessarily equipped to engage fully, from that particular lens of climate change. And so I decided to leave Open North. So I quit. I was like, okay, no, I need to kind of refresh. This was just a little bit before COVID. And ended up with an opportunity that saw me go to move to New York, in Harlem, where I attended the climate school at Columbia University. And the first example that I want to give you, to get into more the kind of the practical aspects of kind of emergency preparedness for community, and from a data collaborative perspective, is through a volunteering effort that I was involved in with We Act for Environmental Justice in Harlem. And we'll share a link to the initiative that I was participating in. And so what you see there, and I invite you to open the link. Oh, okay, even better, we see it here. So this is the Emergency Preparedness Climate Ready Uptown Plan. So this was a kind of grassroots, community-led, kind of co-created initiative by a very, very strong kind of environmental justice organization based in Harlem that is one of the longest standing such organization in the US that, they advise the White House. They're very, very mobilized. They have a very, very strong voice. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of like emphasize and honor that. And what's interesting about this project that I got involved in as a volunteer, and it was nice, like when you're used to kind of being in charge or being very involved in an organization, and then all of a sudden you find yourself back into a volunteering kind of like activist kind of like space, right? So it was really kind of like nurturing and refreshing for me. And so I really much enjoyed kind of being part of a project that ultimately I wasn't accountable for, but I really enjoyed kind of learning and connecting with people that were part of it. And the funding that WeAct got initially was to create a kind of a digital platform that would help community members better prepare themselves for climate emergencies like extreme heat or flooding. But this is not a data story. This is a community story. And so what WeAct did is really kind of mobilize and really kind of engage community members to kind of better understand when we talk about data, we're not just talking about kind of geographical data or kind of like emergency kind of like routes or kind of mapping kind of different kind of physical infrastructure or even like different services that are available during a crisis. We need to we need to start by who is connected with one another and what is the community wisdom and knowledge that is being shared between people, and how do we reinforce that kind of social infrastructure, the social connectivity, as part of building that resilience. And can we not call that data in a way, because that's information, it's data, it's ways that we're kind of we're not just sharing our own lived experience, but if we can kind of capture that and make that kind of better and like to inform our approach to community resilience, we need to account for that kind of qualitative kind of like data, the social data, as well as the kind of digital infrastructure, right? So it's the connectivity between the digital infrastructure and kind of data that is extremely valuable, that provides really the context of where these emergencies like take place. And so with WeAct, we did a number of different kind of roundtables and forums. And we did end up with a digital tool, but that wasn't really the main thing. What you see in what Astrid shared with you was a booklet that was printed that laid out different plans of what community members should be doing before, during, and after a climate emergency. And it also kind of helped facilitate neighborhood or block level kind of like meetings so that you would get to know your neighbor, develop these like phone trees where you would know who to call, and kind of like help you kind of plan ahead, And so that was a printed booklet that was then kind of disseminated across Harlem as a basis for community engagement and meetings, because we know if you just kind of hand out flyers, it's only going to go so far. And then it also created an app where you could kind of, have your own checklist, have a version of that map kind of downloaded on your phone, because you're probably going to run out of kind of electricity, and you'll need to have like a physical copy as well. So that's one example of how kind of like collaboration through different types of data. I was exposed to that through that initiatives in Harlem. Bringing that into the kind of more the Montreal context, I ended up kind of coming back to Montreal, got very involved in a kind of an emerging alliance between the city of Montreal and local climate activist kind of organizations to co-create a common vision of like environmental justice. Long story short, it's called Transition en commun. And it was interesting, right? Because there was a lot of the nonprofit kind of organizations that were involved in Transition en commun were really putting a lot of emphasis on storytelling. And so when we talk about data, that's obviously another data point, right? It's like, these are stories. There are different ways of telling stories, different kind of cultural expressions that we can refer to when we talk about storytelling, not just quotes, but, video or, spoken word or, artistic expressions and whatnot. But what Transition en commun was really interested in is being able to kind of build up that kind of individual and collective narrative around, how our communities preparing themselves for different types of emergencies that are going to occur and that are already occurring, And, in particular, to be able to demonstrate the kind of the territorial inequities that exist in the way that government is allocating resources to meet those needs, in a very, very uneven way across different boroughs on the territory of so-called Montreal. And so for me, that was really interesting from a kind of a data collaborative perspective, because I was looking at it and saying like, okay, but so we're collecting and we want to find out, how we feel and how we're living through this kind of individual and collective experience of, that can be quite traumatic for some populations around emergencies. How do we not just honor, but also kind of respect, the data that is being collected about, people that are living through that trauma or experience. And that got me to connect with or to like sometimes I end up being, it's not brokering, but it's kind of like connecting the dots. I'm sure people like that have different networks, and you're like, oh, you should talk to this person, or this makes me think of that, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's a lot of like what I end up kind of doing just by nature of the networks that I have access to. And in this particular case, it made me think about a whole kind of movement on digital rights and digital rights from a human rights perspective, but digital rights for communities that are most at risk. And if you adopt a digital rights perspective and apply it to a climate justice lens, there's a lot of intersections that should be taking place when we have that conversation, right? So this means that we'd be talking about informed consent. Are we talking about kind of voluntary participation in these types of data collection kind of like approaches? And here I'm just talking about storytelling, but it could be a lot of other types of data. Are you able to opt in, or is it an opt-out type of like process where you are making an informed decision about how your data will be kind of used or reused and for what purposes? Are we protecting my personal data? This is obviously like one of the main kind of preoccupations that people have. Will the data be stored or secured and accessible in Canada, for example, for starters, or is it going to be on some server elsewhere in the US, that gets reutilized for other purposes? These are all the things that are like often kind of sitting a little bit under the surface of conversations when we talk about kind of emergency preparedness or climate action, but that really have an impact on our ability to mobilize and to kind of activate ourselves, right? And to be able to kind of draw, from the data that collectively we could actually pool to make better informed kind of decisions. Obviously, issues around kind of data ownership and control, equity and inclusivity are really important when we kind of design these ways of managing data. Is the data only, is it limited to a certain purpose? Is it only for emergency kind of like contexts, or are there specific timeframes when we can reutilize and reshare data? So you see there's like a pretty long list of like considerations, but that can be quite daunting for organizations that are working kind of like on the front line that don't necessarily have a data governance kind of like analyst within their own team. Most organizations don't. Right. And so part of the facilitation that I've been doing with these coalitions that are mobilizing around climate action is not just to raise awareness about that, is to actually kind of help set up community data agreements that are reflective of the purpose that we want to have with the data that is being collected by different people for different objectives. And it needs to be, I'll really emphasize that it's a process that's kind of co-designed, co-facilitated. It's not a kind of a template that's like, adopted and like everybody should follow a particular set of rules. There are some compliance issues when we're talking about data. So it needs to fit within a regulatory and kind of legal framework, at the local, provincial, or kind of like national level. There are certain things that you can and can't do when you're collecting data about Canadian citizens. But it's really about kind of establishing that community data agreement in a collaborative way. And I think we had a couple of resources too that we wanted to share in the chat. And the last thing that I want to say, just to kind of like open it up for discussion here, and feel free to kind of run with whatever idea that I'm proposing here, and I'd love to I want to hear your own perspective on this, because I'm sure you do have a different angle on that. And the last thing that I want to say, because some of the work that I'm doing right now is affiliated with Concordia University, where I lead the Montreal Climate Action, the Climate Data Hub, which is a collaborative, multi-sectorial kind of initiative where we're sharing data amongst different stakeholders, including the city, but also kind of utilities companies, as well as environmental justice kind of coalitions. But how do you broker that? How do you create the enabling environment to do that in a trusted way? Right. And so like the data collaborative kind of like co-design process, it's taken us about like 2 years to get to that. But one thing that I want to name is what I've learned through these different experiences is like there's a collective interest to better collaborate around data sharing, but it also relies on a particular function of brokering relationships between institutions and sectors that have very particular ways of thinking about data, and they don't often listen to each other, or when they listen, they don't necessarily understand each other. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. So from a university perspective, like when I talk to researchers as well as civic activists in the climate space, researchers, are obviously, I don't want to like generalize too much, but some of the things that you'll encounter, can be that, well, how does it advance my research interests? And wanting to control, the data that's being kind of collected, about people and publish and kind of, do their work. Well, there's a lot of issues around from a data collaborative perspective and community data agreements perspective. And that's not necessarily something that's built in to the relationships between kind of academia and community stakeholders. There's a lot of good intentions. And I feel like we're seeing kind of a rise of kind of, especially kind of newer, kind of younger academics that aren't just seeing themselves as academics, but they're very engaged in the world and they're already participating in a lot of initiatives, and they understand kind of the need for reciprocity and evenness, to set those terms of kind of collaboration around data sharing. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that intersection that take place. Often collaborative data agreements is a process that is often kind of like not as appreciated as it should be. And it's kind of a good practice that I'm seeing that, we need to kind of name that in if we're about building relationships, well, we need to kind of situate how we talk about data and come up with these collaborative data agreements in order to facilitate trust, because ultimately, if we don't have that trust, then somebody collects data about us or about the people that we're kind of working with, and then it gets misused or repurposed or commercialized even. So there's a lot of potential risks around it. And if we don't crack the kind of data collaborative kind of like aspect of our mobilization around community preparedness, especially in a time of crisis, where we see systems kind of closing in and trying to kind of optimize, how they manage a crisis, that's not the optimal place to share data or to build trust. That's not what governments necessarily look for. They'll look for kind of emergency response. When you're responding in a context of emergency, you're not necessarily spending time developing a process to build community data agreements, right? So it's kind of like on us as community to kind of think through those notions and those principles so that we can kind of preemptively kind of establish them with, government and researchers and kind of like other stakeholders and amongst ourselves, so that when we are facing the pressures of a climate emergency, then we have the language and the governance that enables us to kind of share with one another, and because that's when we need it the most. So I'll stop there, giving you a few examples, but it's not that I'm much more interested, but I'm very interested in kind of seeing how that connects with you and what are the kinds of issues that you're wrestling with when we talk about data collaboration in a context of kind of emergency preparedness. And then probably won't have all the answers, but at least we can have a conversation around it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jean-Noé. Maybe I'll kick us off. I think two things really stood out for me was I think like the whole topic of data in communities can be quite of I don't know, it's a bit of a like a hot potato. It's kind of gets avoided, I feel. And I've been, I was very involved with in the community during the COVID pandemic and the different efforts that went ongoing and then. And I think it's just because, like I said, there's like so many questions. And I think, and like all these fears and all of these things. And yet at the same time, we have all these different organizations. And I'm really going back to thinking about like how we had to work together and during the pandemic and at local levels and like a neighborhood level, borough level, municipal level, whatever. And different organizations were holding lots of information. Like everybody had, our what they want to call them, beneficiaries or clients, which is not really the term I like, but the people that you are supporting or serving, whatever your mission is, have lots of all kinds of information and have the trusting relationships. Yet there we were in the moment of crisis, and certain organizations knew who were the vulnerable folks in the community. Others had other additional information, and maybe on food security. Maybe others had things about families that were in difficulty, and all of these things. Yet we were not able to meaningfully collaborate, I would say, data level at least. So I think like this thing about and doing it in the moment of crisis obviously was it's you have so many other things going on at that moment. So I think like when we think about the emergency preparedness, thinking about that ahead of time, right? And what is the next, whether it's a climate emergency or a health emergency or a major flood or a fire or whatever it might be, right? I think that's really, really important. And I think like that whole concept of collaboration, it's really stood out for me. And I think it's not evident, it is not evident, and it doesn't happen on its own, for sure. And I saw as well, Ian had popped questions into the chat as well. Ian was asking where you see gaps in data collection and research, or where the future of data collection is going, especially the role of AI, and looking for some examples of how data has been used to inform policy.
Yeah, that's an easy question. Yeah, it's pretty big. I mean, I think part of the challenge here, well, with AI, like how can I put it? It's like for me, I'm still stuck on the problem of like who makes decisions about data sharing, before getting into like, the appeal of what kind of AI like could do. Because ultimately, I really believe strongly that it is about kind of setting really kind of like clear governance principles, about the data that we're talking about. And it's not to say that like we should kind of just not deal with the AI, because the AI is kind of dealing with us in a way. So we have to kind of anticipate, what that entails. An example of how AI kind of fits here, just recently just got funding from Columbia University to work with that climate activist community that I told you about, Transition en Commun in Montreal. And we're looking at how do we adapt AI tools, specifically with like language processing, to be able to derive more meaning from quotes and different types of like stories that we're collecting through different approaches. But the key thing here is, what do the AI tools enable us to learn, and how do we use that as not an authoritative kind of truth about ourselves, but as an additional perspective into a community-led conversation that sets our own kind of context and our sense of priorities and concerns. And that's really, really important, because that's kind of like the bridge between, what AI can tell us, but then also kind of trusting ourselves as community kind of leaders and as community members, that there's no AI machine kind of walking around kind of like experiencing kind of how our neighborhoods are changing, or how it feels like to live in a community that's impacted by, different types of extreme weather events. And so from a process perspective, when you're thinking about AI, you still need to think about, beginning with, like I said, community priorities and concerns, looking at how to contextualize that conversation. What concerns are we most are we concerned the most about, when emergencies do hit our community? What resources, do we think we should improve, for our community's preparedness? Are there related data, to these real real world impacts? How can we use stories and scenarios, also to kind of anticipate, different types of ways that, we may need to shift our preparedness, kind of like services or resilience, or even kind of the connective kind of like tissue that exists in community. And then how do we introduce kind of like data principles as part of a safeguard, to be able to mitigate these concerns as well. So, and I could share kind of like resources subsequent to that, but I think it's really kind of holding a space that is about data in our preparedness, but not starting from that perspective, starting from the needs and concerns. And I think that's really, really important, because you could get so quickly wrapped up in the technicalities of it. And that creates like barriers and perceive kind of inequities, even in the language and ability to engage in a conversation about data. And so data needs to kind of, is an added lens to a community-led conversation around preparedness. And then you start kind of peeling the layers a little bit. Is there a data that's already available that we could share, where we could learn from one another, that's not sensitive information or sensitive data? How do we kind of collaborate maybe with researchers, that have, some expertise that they can lend to that, which is a community-led conversation. So researchers are kind of being engaged in support of that conversation. And then kind of prototype the approach. The last thing that I would advise folks to do is try to do like a full comprehensive data kind of inventory. So you start mapping all the data assets, and then you start kind of understanding like, what are the barriers to sharing? That's like, it's almost impossible, because by the time you even get close to finishing that inventory of that data asset mapping, then it's probably outdated and you probably need to start over, right? So it's really kind of like starting a conversation, naming explicitly fears or potential kind of threats, insecurities, about talking about data, and then finding kind of that kind of opportunity kind of like window to say like, maybe we could share data, and if we do that, then we'd be able to kind of put our heads together, and then you get into that kind of collective wisdom and connective intelligence of like kind of data sharing and doing it, under terms that are kind of secure and safe for the data that we're talking about.
Right. And that makes me think of as well how there is that potential also, and I guess the risk of decisions being made of, as you just mentioned, if you solely focus on the data piece alone, that what are the decisions that will be then made, and then who is impacted by what is being considered and not being considered, actually, right? Because we're missing a lot of the narrative, a lot of the context. And I think like at Tamarack, we talk so much about the community expertise, the context lies within the community and not in some kind of report or a data set somewhere necessarily, right?
Yeah.
But it's so important to keep in mind, right? And we have lots of juicy questions and comments in the chat.
Can I go with the one with Jacob
Yeah.
from Jacob?
Yeah, go for
That kind
it.
of struck me, because I think it kind of fits with how do we communicate kind of community kind of like information or community wisdom, and kind of like thinking beyond kind of like data here, right? And a practical or kind of like a real example that I heard about, again, when I was living in New York, and you had kind of hurricanes that were coming in, and it's a coastal community, right? So you have like residents that are kind of directly affected by these massive storms. And there were like two big ones that occurred. And the first one, you had public officials or people from the city that were going kind of house to house or sending out kind of notifications like, watch out, or even like tweeting like, hey, the storm is coming, the storm is coming. People weren't really kind of connecting with that. A lot of people didn't move, when the storm hit, a lot of people like kind of like suffered the consequences for that, even though they had received a lot of notifications. And then the second storm, and this is the one when I was living in Harlem, instead of having kind of like a government kind of communication channels, you know who went door to door to kind of communicate that the storm was coming and that it should be taken seriously? The surfing community. So it was people that they know the storms, they know the water, they're there, you know. And so you had the I think it was a community organization that mobilized kind of like the surfing community, and then they went door to door. And then they said, like, you should really take this storm seriously. And so this speaks, and people did. And so this speaks to who conveys kind of information that can be quite complex, even kind of like in levels of like scientific knowledge that are extremely difficult to understand, you know, like understanding the science of like a hurricane or the science of like flooding and these things. At the end of the day, people want to know, you know, am I safe? And where do I go? Essentially, you know? And so the channels through which kind of scientific kind of knowledge is communicated really matters, right? And who builds that trust and who has that credibility to kind of advocate for that. So I just want to kind of give that example because it can become very overwhelming. And I think what I would say to Jacob also is kind of building a, like, not try to overwhelm people with a lot of information at the last minute, you know, but kind of like shifting the way that information is shared, you know, in a more regular way, you know, so that, you know, we have a sense of a build up towards, you know, a crisis, as opposed to being constantly kind of like, okay, normal life, crisis, and then like preparedness, and then shift and kind of move your things out and like all of that. So I think it's like, there's no like perfect solution to that, but I would just say like learning how to communicate kind of important kind of like data points and finding the right people to be able to kind of, you know, speak about those in a way that connects credibly to people that are most at risk, I think is probably something that needs to be worked out over multiple years, you know? So it's really that resilience piece that has to be built into kind of the preparedness aspect of crisis management.
Yeah, so true. And I think as well, like whilst we're on this role, this specific role, and then we have other things as well in the chat. Ian had also brought up a really good point about how so much of data collection, that the data, that information that, you know, organizations hold is driven by funder priorities, and funders have a lot of data as well, right? As a consequence. But what happened, you know what I mean? So I think. Anyway, and also I wanted as well, if anybody wants to also come off mute, raise your hand if you wanted to just verbalize what thoughts are coming up or questions you have for Jean-Noé, feel free to do that as well.
So I would say, like, just on the point that Ian is making, okay, and I do welcome like people to speak up too. I would say that from a data collaborative perspective, the conversations that I'm in with certain funders, they're almost like readier than ever to have a conversation about sharing their data as well because of the stakes. And so I wouldn't shy away to say, like, where's the reciprocity in the funder kind of you know, fundee kind of like relationship when we're talking about data collection. If we have like similar interests and potentially similar values, hopefully, then can we not try to share data? How about you tell us a little bit more about what you know? You know, so this doesn't feel like an extractive process where you have data brokers and data holders, you know, and where we have no visibility and kind of like very little access, you know, to that data. And I think that there's ways to be able to kind of establish terms where you have more control over the data that is being collected, you know, through different programs and activities that are funded by different donors as well. So I think there's a shift there in recognition of the level of threat and level of risk that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Jean-Noé. I think if I may jump to Kara's comment as well. She works with Alberta. maybe Cara, do you want to maybe speak to your question?
Yeah, in Alberta, we have the Alberta Digital ID, and it's connected to our driver's license. It's connected to our provincial health data. It's connected to like student loan information. It's connected to our taxes. And in the past, like recently, past 3-4 years, the province has we also have an online reception center program. And so now that is connected so that people can register for supports at a registration center instead of having them come up to a desk and us, data entry that. And so I'm just a little bit concerned because of like how much information is connected to our digital ID. And granted, like both those programs are the province, but it's also connected to our federal information, and it's also connected to our health information, and it's also connected to finance information. And just the people that have access to just the registration program are people throughout the province. Granted, they're trained in emergency management and reception centers and doing registrations. But some of those people are just residents who are volunteers, right? That get trained on the program, blah, blah. But still coming across quite a lot of people. We hosted in Alberta thousands of people from Northwest Territories last summer. In St. Albert, we had over 850 people that we were registering, and a lot of people are really concerned about the government having their information. Not that the government doesn't have all your information anyway, but giving more information to government to be tracked, because that's what we were doing. We were tracking them because they were coming down and moving from different towns and cities and municipalities to go, hear that, ooh, St. Albert has a better supports at their reception center, so I want to go there or whatever. So it just it's very convoluted, because for the workers who are working in the registration center, it's ideal for people to register themselves, right? Because then you don't have to, because it takes 15-20 minutes to do one family, right? Set them up in a hotel or whatever, right? So all of that data. Also, you when you're registering somebody, you're collecting data about what they need, like if they left their meds behind or they need whatever, right? Whatever it is that they need, psychological supports or anything like that. And all of that is just in there. And so if I wanted, I could go on the registration program right now and find information about people on the other side of the province or in my own city, and that's not like, that's my concern. I guess, and I don't know that you have an answer for that, but I think because like the province justifies it because they're both provincial data collection points, I guess.
Yeah. It's a big issue, and I'm glad that you're raising it, because it also it ties into so many different kind of interconnected kind of like topics, right? Like within the context of like disinformation and distrust in government and like a greater reliance on government. So it's like all these kind of contradictory things that are happening kind of simultaneously. And then at the end of the day, it's like, what kind of like control do I have? It's like a feeling of kind of a bit of a loss of control. Yeah. And then that doesn't feel very good, because it exacerbates or even amplifies your feeling of vulnerability, because you're like, well, they're just taking all the data that they can or want. I have no idea how it's being used. And then I hope that they're able to use it in a way that responds to kind of, a situation where I'm in a situation of threat and whatnot. So there's a couple of things that I could say about that. One is to because we are dealing with government, and so this isn't the same obligation that a private sector company would have, because they also do that, but they do it differently, and you don't have the same recourse as you would with government. Kind of like it's to understand and to reach out to the people that are on the side of citizens, and whose job it is to explain what are the rules, what are the terms by which government is being able to collect data about you. And so that could be a privacy commissioner or an access to information kind of commissioner or an ombudsman. Like all of these people, they have a particular role in kind of explaining how the system works and what recourse you have if you want your data not to be collected, for example. Like they have an obligation to kind of explain that to you. So I think using the institutions, and recognizing that, government is there ultimately in the public interest. And so you need to be able to kind of like work with the people who really take that kind of like at heart, and whose job it is to do that. The other thing is that kind of gaining a kind of a bit more of a kind of, and I'm not saying that's not the case in the example that you're giving, but I found for myself that sometimes it's kind of finding a different language kind of to speak about that extractiveness of like data collection. And one reference that I could provide is the OCAP principles from Indigenous communities. And OCAP principles, here, we can share that here. Share it in the chat. So this is so First Nations principles of OCAP. And when they talk about OCAP, they talk about ownership, control, access, possession. And what's important about those principles is that, yes, they have to do with Indigenous communities and their relationship with the government of Canada, but you can also apply those principles in pretty much any citizen's relationship with a government that is kind of, extracting data or collecting data. And it creates a bit of a fluency or a language or kind of different kind of ways of thinking about engaging in a very asymmetrical kind of like power relationship as well. So I would kind of urge kind of looking at Indigenous data sovereignty and how that can be applied to a context like this, because ultimately, we need to be able to know, and we need to understand the rules. And then we need to know, like, if we want to opt out and we only want to share our data, with, people that we trust, then we should be able to do that. Yeah, so I'll stop there. But I ended up like training all of my staff on OCAP because we were dealing with smart cities. And I was like, oh no, apply OCAP principles to a smart cities context. It was like, what? Oh yeah, that actually works a lot. And so we ended up kind of working and fought the Sidewalk Labs, kind of like a mobilization using the OCAP principles at the heart of our advocacy against Google and Alphabet that we're trying to build a future city in Toronto.
Right. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean-Noé. Yeah, I think it like makes me really think about like how in so many ways the whole data perspective aspect is like, I think there's like capacity building that's needed so that like to demystify it for starters, but also just like bring in like in ways you can take action in a meaningful way, right? But I guess it starts with relationships, starts with talking with one another, starts with thinking about, well, what is it? So okay, we're not going to share perhaps the address of a person and whatnot. However, there's a lot of like what are those aggregated things that we can share, and what are the narratives and the stories that we know that we can share as well. That there's a lot that we can share with that help the collective. instead of sort of holding on to it. But I think there's that aspect as well. I think you and I spoke about it, but when we were talking about it for preparing for this session today, the aspect of kind of like the colonial ways and very top-down ways as well, and how organizations and institutions work in communities.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the turf and just then. So we're kind of like a full circle back to collaboration, relationships,
That's it.
and untangling that, and asking those questions, right? Who are the folks that are closest to the problem? What is it? What they have to say about it, right?
And experimenting, starting and just to see how you can do it, because it is possible to de-anonymize or depersonalize data. You can protect people's identity, and share data, and it can be very, very valuable to do that. You just have to
Right.
do it in a controlled way and not try to do it as like a big. I wouldn't start with like a massive program. Start small. In the data collaboration kind of data governance space, we talk about building data trusts. There's a reason for that. You start small, you build that trust, and then you expand, you see how you can do it, and you start from the priority concerns and problems, and then you kind of scale it.
So
Yeah.
true, so true. Yeah, thank you. But we are pretty much at the end. So we do have to wrap up our discussion. I hope this has been interesting, informative, perhaps opened up a few avenues for you and all. And I think it makes me think as well, maybe one last reflection to share is as you said, is like don't be paralyzed by just like thinking, okay, but what about all these risks? And like, so we won't do anything, right? Like you can start with lots of things.
Yeah.
And you even at the bare minimum, you know what, perhaps if you don't trust anybody else, let's say at neighborhood level, you might trust your neighbors, immediate on your block. And if you just shared your phone numbers and you knew who was who in the event of an emergency, how powerful is that?
Yeah.
So at the bare minimum, and there's no data bank needed for that and things like that. So before you all shoot off to all your different directions, I just wanted to share we have a big event coming up at Tamarack. Engage Fest. If you might have perhaps received an email, and if not, we invite you to check it out. I will pop the link in the chat for that, which is coming up October 29th and 30th. Jean-Noé is actually doing a workshop as well on day 2 with his colleague Stéphane Guidon about the systemic mediation. And we're going to have fantastic speakers like Margaret Wheatley, George A., and many others. We're going to have tool shares. We're going to have many other workshops as well. So please do check it out. And one other thing to share is that we have this series of webinars currently running. We have it's a 4-part series on overcoming challenges in local climate action. Because we know there's lots of plans out there, but action is not advancing. So we have teamed up with Climate Reality, Climate Caucus, Clean Air Partnership, and David Suzuki Foundation on this 4-part series. And there's one coming up on November 4th. And I'm going to just try and quickly pop the link in the chat as well. So if you'd like to register for that, this is free. And then there's 2 others coming in December and January. And I think that is it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jean-Noé. Thanks to all the folks that came today. Sorry, the link is bold for some reason. I'm sorry. But anyway, so please do reach out to us if you have any other questions, if you have any other comments that you want to share to Jean-Noé. I can pass those along as well. And I'm sure you'll see him on other things upcoming with Tamarack. And wishing you all a wonderful rest of your days. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Bye.
Thank you.